Vidal, and we have so many other speakers coming from Google, Adobe, we have some Twitter, and we have some from Microsoft. So they are all, and we have some from some other big companies too. So when I met all of them, I told them one thing, that we have so many mentees joining this program and they want to learn, they want to improve. So we have some beginners and we have some experts. But right now, we need to make sure the experts or the intermediates, they level up, the beginners, they learn and learn very well. So the major aim of this program is to make sure everybody that joins this program knows what technical writing is, can write technical article, can improve technical documentation. And at the end also, we have the last part. If you go through the curriculum, you'll see we have the section for interview. So we'll have to invite a senior recruiter that will join us and teach us how to apply for jobs and get ready to get jobs. So at this point, I would, do we have some time? Okay. So I think I would have to invite Quentin. So Quentin is a product manager and he is also a hiring manager. So he hired me as the technical writer for the company. So he has some things to sell us. So Quentin, the mic is over to you. Yeah, I can't hear you. We can't hear you. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, just adding some blur so you can focus on my face here. Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you all. I'm talking to you today from the United States. And as Wisdom said, I hired him for Accumulate almost a year ago now. Or no, I guess we're going on 8 months. And one of the reasons why I hired Wisdom, why I thought he was so good, is because I saw his passion for technical writing. And his ability to really think about what it is that a user needs when looking at documentation. And so above everything else, understanding your audience and understanding who the documentation is for and being able to give the user what they need to understand the product is by far most important. And so if you have that passion and you have the passion for really helping users, then you'll do great as a technical writer. Let me just see here if I can share my screen. Give me one moment. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes. All right, so a little background on myself. So I'm a product manager for Accumulate. And being a product manager really means putting yourself in the shoes of the user and understand what the user needs. And that naturally extends to documentation. And so as technical writers, we want our technical writers to really have that same mindset, like I was saying before. And so just to give you a little background on what we do at Accumulate, because we do, one of the important things with writing documentation is you have to tailor it to your user base. So Accumulate is a blockchain protocol. And because of that, most of our users are developers that will be using the protocol in one way or the other. And because of that, we have a very developer-focused documentation and knowledge base. It's slightly more technical. So some of the things here are going to be, some of the advice I give you is going to be coming from that world. But as a technical writer, you might be writing documentation for more traditional software, or you might be writing documentation for a physical product. And so a few things translate over, but a lot of what you need to do is understand who is your user base and what tools are useful for you for that type of product. All right, so getting into it, why is great documentation important? So I think the number one reason why documentation is important, of course, documentation is important to help the user understand how to use the product. But what makes it really important is that it's the first line of defense against the tsunami of user questions that the company will receive if you don't have good documentation. And when we're talking about products that reaches a user base of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of users, it is extremely difficult to have to deal and have the infrastructure set up to deal with a massive amount of questions. And so the better the documentation is, the more questions you can answer just through your documentation site, the less questions that the company has to deal with answering on a one-on-one basis. Chances are, if someone's asking a question, you're going to get 10 or 100 more questions just like that one. And so it's very important from a company perspective to really be able to be efficient. And as you know, companies care very much about efficiency and keeping costs low. So the next reason why great documentation is important is that it's a great marketing tool. I come from a software development background, and I can tell you that when I was looking for new software whether it was some sort of API to use in my application or some sort of middleware, if it had poor documentation, I immediately went to the other one. I went to look for other products that had better documentation rather than sending emails asking for more information, because there's a lot of tools out there. It's a big world, and with the internet, it's very easy to find a lot of tools that can fit your needs. And so as soon as you see poor documentation or you don't understand how to do a certain thing, sometimes it's easier to or has good documentation is naturally more attractive. So it's a great way to help attract and sustain communities. In the blockchain world, communities are very important. And being able to attract developers to build on your blockchain is very important. And so documentation is an important way to really bring in those audiences. And then the last reason why great documentation is so important, and actually I'm getting some feedback. Can everyone in the audience please mute themselves? Right, Stephen, thank you. And actually there's someone else. Thank you, great. And so the last reason why documentation is so important is it's a reflection on the quality of the product itself. If I'm looking at poor documentation, it's poorly written, there's lots of spelling mistakes, it tells me as a user that the company didn't care enough to have good documentation, and therefore they probably didn't care enough about their product to make sure the quality of the product was good too. And so users are smart, especially users for software, users for products that actually go through documentation. They know how to spot a good product and a bad product. And if you have poor documentation, then that will reflect poorly on the product itself. So now, how do you as a technical writer make great documentation? So there's a lot of ways to make great documentation. These are just how I feel as a product manager makes great documentation for a product. The number one thing is that it's detailed. So it answers any of the questions that the users might be thinking, even before they think it. As they're going through the documentation, they might have more questions, and it should be easy for them to navigate through the documentation and understand where to go to find their answers. And to do that, you need to have well-organized documentation. So don't have one giant document that explains the whole product and everything the product can do. Have it sectioned off. Have articles that are specific to reference. So if your product is an API, for example, you can have the API reference documentation where you just list all the methods that are available and all the parameters they need. But then you can also have guides that setup guides and guides to walk you through the flow to best interact with that API. And that guide should be separate from the reference documentation, and it should be clearly labeled. So the user knows where to go. If they just need to find what parameter they need for this specific method, they know to go to the reference documentation. And if it's their first time using the documentation and they don't know how to get started, then they'll go to the Getting Started documentation. So make sure your documentation is well organized, make sure it's clearly labeled, And definitely make sure that your documentation is well written. I think, of course, that goes without saying. Poor written documentation reflects poorly on the product. So use tools to help you keep that documentation well written, check the grammar, check the spelling, and also think about the format. Think about having a good intro that helps introduce the user to the topic at hand. Have a good conclusion. Really think of it like an article or a story. And if you think about it in the context of a story, you want a good beginning, middle, and end. Interactivity is very important, and this may be more important for software type products or products that are geared towards developers. So if your product is software, if it's an API, for example, or if it's a blockchain protocol, code samples are really important. So not just explaining to the user what to do to get this specific piece of information or get this operation correct. Give them the actual code. Let them see it for themselves. They may have to tweak a little bit themselves, but oftentimes developers will quite literally take the code that's in that code sample and paste it into their own project, which is totally fine. The users can use the product however they want. And so you should make sure that that code sample is high quality because you may see a lot of that. And if it's not specifically a product for developers, or even if it is, you still want to see lots of diagrams that kind of explain how the product works, how it interacts with maybe the other products in there. I'm thinking in terms of software and their tech stack, how the middleware would interact with the other components of their software. It'd be great to have diagrams for that. And screenshots as well. And screenshots are important if it's more user-facing software. So perhaps it's a mobile app, and it's not really geared towards developers, but you still want to show screenshots. So when you're speaking about clicking a certain button, the user knows exactly which button you're talking about. And with that comes lots of guidance. You want to make sure that all the functionality of the product is documented. But beyond that, you want to make sure that the user has all of their needs met and are able to walk through some of the common workflows that you might see for that product. So walk them through the getting started functions of the product. Have some exercises for perhaps more advanced functions. For example, in Accumulate, we have several different account types for our blockchain. And so we have several tutorials, all written by Wisdom, which walk you through how to create an account, how to send a transaction. And we have multiple types of accounts. So we have a tutorial for this type of account, for that type of account. I won't go too far into the details there because this is not about Accumulate, but the point being that the more guidance you can give, the better. And really having an interactive approach, telling the user what to do, and having them walk through a whole lesson, treating it like a class. It's extremely helpful. And now when writing great documentation, it's hard to say how the best way to write documentation is, especially we're talking about a huge range of products out there. And the process might look very different for the documentation of an API versus the documentation of a mobile app versus the documentation of an IoT device. You might be documenting an air quality sensor. Obviously, the documentation for such a product would look quite different. But there are some universal steps that you can take. So the first step, create a list of all the topics you want to cover. Create a list of all the functions that the product offers, all the features it has. Create a list of all the workflows that perhaps you've believe will be the most difficult for users, that maybe you find the most difficult. And you can even, canvas users yourself. You can ask people to look at the product and ask what they find most difficult and they would like to see a guide for, and use that to help you understand what sorts of guides you should create. So put yourself in the user's shoes. That is, if there's one thing you take away from this presentation today, that's the number one thing. If you're thinking from the mindset of your user, you're thinking about what their needs are, then you'll do just fine creating documentation for them, because you'll know what they need. And use lots of tools. Use Grammarly. Grammarly is a great tool to make sure that it's well written, and you're writing, and all your writing is correctly punctuated and correctly spelled. Gitbook, we use Gitbook at Accumulate. We find it very easy to create documentation that looks good and is clearly organized. There's a lot of different products like Gitbook out there. Gitbook is the one we use. Postman, that's specifically if we're talking about an API product. If you're documenting an API, Postman will become your best friend. And again, this is coming from our domain in the software world and specifically in the blockchain software world. Depending on your product, there might be a whole different set of tools that will be useful for you. So number one, which I didn't write here, but your number one tool is Google. Use Google to find new programs, and reach out to other documentation writers in that community, in that industry, and see what kind of tools they use. Use lots of examples. Examples are never bad. There's no such thing as too many examples. The more the better. If it's software, if it's a protocol, use lots of code samples. If it's an API, use lots of API examples. If it's hardware, you may have to be more creative about how you use examples, but there's a lot you can do, especially with digital documentation. You can do videos, you can do pictures. You could perhaps even do 3D animations, depending on the budget of your company. So think outside the box and think about what kind of examples your user would like to see. And gather feedback from users. So write an article, send it out to different users, send it out to friends, ask them what they think about it, if they had any questions or any troubles while they were going through it, so you can identify what those weak points are and make them better. So as long as you're gathering constant feedback, you're fixing what may not be as well written or not be as well explained, then you will absolutely create very great and very high quality documentation. And so that pretty much sums it up for my advice to you. So any questions?
Hi guys. So I guess this is time for
I
questions.
have a quick.
All right, go ahead. So any question you have, okay, just go ahead and ask.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Olise, go ahead and ask.
Hey, good evening. Hello? Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, good evening, Quentin. So my question is, I am new to technical writing. So how do I get to your level or wisdom's level in the area of technical writing?
That's a great question. And I think wisdom is perhaps better to answer that, because I personally am not a technical writer, but I can tell you what I look for in a technical writer. And so from my perspective, what I look for is passion and an understanding of the user and the product. So if you're documenting an API, or if I'm hiring you to document an API, you should know what an API is and how to use an API. Sorry, excuse me. So that's very important. And it really ranges depending on what product you're applying to document or what company you're applying to. If it's a software company, you should have a basic understanding of APIs, and you don't need to know code yourself, but you need to have a general understanding of what developers look for. And you also need to be willing to put yourself out there and ask questions. So if you are developing documentation for a protocol for other developers, like Wisdom is for Accumulate, make sure that you have good lines of communication with the engineers on that product. So Wisdom, I know, often has to interview the engineers and ask them questions, and he asks them a lot of questions. But the number one thing to remember is don't feel bad about being annoying, because if you are asking these questions, chances are the users will ask those questions too. So much better that you annoy the engineers and you get all the answers first, so then you can write good documentation and they won't get a million times more questions of the same sort later on. So that's my advice to you and Wisdom in terms of becoming a good technical writer. I think you're probably better to answer that from the technical writer perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Quentin, for that. Anyways, I don't have much to say on that part because this program would definitely, what I would say is that you're here for a reason, and this program will make sure it covers every part that will make you get to my level. For sure, I want everybody here to be much better than myself, and my happiness would be at the end of the program, I would get success stories of, hey, I've gotten to this level, I can build this, I can write an API, I have gotten a job as technical writer. That would give me so much joy. So what I would say is be consistent with the program because we're having more calls like this. We'll have more documents submitted for you to do. We'll also have projects for everybody to build every week. So just make sure you're consistent with the program, consistent with the projects, and trust me, you'll be way better than myself because that would be what would give me happiness for sure. So any other question for Quentin?
So just to add one more thing to that too. So Accumulate is a blockchain company. And so we specifically looked for documentation writers that have experience with blockchain or understand blockchain. And so one of the reasons why I hired Wisdom is because I saw that he had blockchain experience and he had written articles on his own about how to do a certain thing in a certain blockchain. So one thing I recommend that could be very helpful to help you gain experience and also to show to your potential employers, have a specific sector you want to focus on, and then just start writing your own documentation for that product. So take an API, look for some cool APIs out there, and just write your own guide on how to use it. And then you could use that as part of your portfolio to show that you know how to use an API and you know how to document an API. And companies will find that very helpful in understanding your level as a technical writer and your passion.
All right, thank you, Quentin, for that advice. So, okay, is it BC, do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
All right, go ahead.
I have three questions. The first one is, Quentin mentioned that illustrations, screenshots, images are essential when writing a document. I understand that when you're using these graphics as examples, you will need to edit them to point out certain parts that you're talking about on a step. So is there a software to do that, to edit an image or maybe a screenshot of steps and you point out, okay, you click here to do this? That's the first question. Then second question is, what format is best to deliver a document to a client? And three, is there a writing platform for technical writers? Maybe different from what Microsoft Word or Google Docs?
All great questions. And actually, let me go back to one of these slides. So in terms of what format or what tools you can use besides Google Docs and Microsoft Word, so at Accumulate, we use Gitbook, but Gitbook is far from the only one available. Gitbook is the one that we use because we found it easy and simple and quick to make good documentation. So that's an example of one. And it's probably a good place to start. It's one of the easier ones, but we also use Google Docs as well. What Wisdom usually does is he delivers his article as a Google Doc first. We go through it, we write comments, we do a few edits. Once it's at a good stage, then he converts it over to Gitbook. And Gitbook uses Markdown language. Markdown language is probably the most common format for documentation, at least in software. So I would definitely get yourself familiar with Markdown language as well, at least if you're going into software technical writing. It's not very hard, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue. In terms of the other tools, besides Gitbook and besides Grammarly, which I also highly recommend, the tools are really dependent on what industry you're going into, and they'll really differ. So again, if your company was asking you to document an API, you would probably need to use Postman. But there's also Swagger. I know Wisdom himself likes to use Swagger. Postman and Swagger are both API tools. So it really is dependent on what the product is. And your best bet is to go onto Google and just search for tools for that type of product. So if it's an API, search for API tools. If it's a blockchain, search for blockchain tools. I hope that answered your question. Was there, I forget what your second or third question was. Is there anything that I didn't answer?
Yeah, I guess the correct
No.
next was more like the writing platform. Yeah, so the writing platform we have different writing platform, but it's not specific to technical writers. It's just generally for writing. You have Medium, you have Hashnode, and you have Dev.to. So all these are platforms you can go on to write. Now for Medium, it's more about the plain text. If you're probably good with plain text, you go on Medium. But if you probably want to learn more or want to use more on Markdown formats, then you have to use Hashnode and Dev.to. So they work with more of Markdown. So they will really help you learn that much. All right, thank you for your questions. I guess Kenneth has a question or something.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. Okay, my question is, the whole technical writing stuff is still kind of sounding so abstract. Now, as a technical writer, I get that you are teaching, or rather, educating users on how to use a particular product. Now, my question is, if a product is developed with a language like JavaScript, now, of course, you need to understand how JavaScript was for you to be able to communicate. Is a question, do you need to understand how JavaScript works for you to be able to write a proper documentation for that software or product? And if yes, how good are you going to be with the JavaScript or any other language to be able to write that documentation? Thank you.
So that's a good question. And I think the higher level of that question is what is the scope of what you need to educate your users on? And that's really, that's something that you have to decide for yourself. So for example, in Accumulate is written in Go. And in order to install Accumulate, you need to have a Go environment set up. And so we face that same question, which is how much of setting up Go do we have to walk our users through? Because it's not our software. It's not really our responsibility to teach users on how to use Go. So we decided to look at the installation documents that Go provided And for the parts that we thought it was sufficiently covered, we said, please check out the Go documentation here. And we sent a link. And then for the parts that we thought weren't really captured well enough in the Go documentation, we wrote a quick guide. And so you should really think about it on a case-by-case basis. If documentation already exists out there, just link to it. Use the documentation that exists. There's nothing wrong with that, especially for open source software. And in a lot of ways, that's even better because when the software is upgraded, then it'll automatically have the updated documentation as well. And you won't have to worry about having to update your documentation every time one of their dependencies gets updated. So I would say keep it at a case-by-case basis. You really have to think actively about your user, how experienced is your user, and that should help you understand how deep you need to go for your user.
Yeah, so let me add to what Quentin said. So for me, it's very important for you to understand the tool. For instance, we talked about JavaScript. So you probably need a very good knowledge of JavaScript before you can document a JavaScript documentation, because when you don't have that very good knowledge, trust me, you would probably not document it very well. So adding to what Quentin said too, so you need to also watch the case by case. Okay. So okay, Steven, I guess you have a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I wanted to know the website of your company. Maybe I can go look out the sample of your work to get an idea of what you're really talking about. Possibly, okay, if I visit a website, maybe crypto-related site, where should I look out for the documentation or any other website? What's your suggestion?
Absolutely. So I'm going to put a link to the Accumulate website, and I'll put a link to the Docs website, which is separate. So on the main website, we do have a link to the documentation. But then we have the documentation website, which is at the same domain. I'm putting here. So it's docs.accumulatenetwork.io. So that should definitely give you a sense.
All right, so let's take a few questions so Quentin can wrap up. All right, so Habib, I think you have a question or something.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I think he has answered my question because you've been mentioning API and it does backend related work. I know I work with it as well, but I'm a mobile and a front-end developer, so I'm just asking if I can be like add that to my skill as a technical writer in that aspect, whereby I implement features and I write about that, which I've implemented. So,
Absolutely. You should, if you have any technical skills, any development skills, that goes a long way. And that is especially important for software products. So if you have any technical skills, any coding skills, definitely stress that as much as you can. We do love to see that.
okay, that's good. Thank you very much.
All right, so I have a question here by Ifeanyi Oliver saying, must I have the knowledge of all programming language or more languages to enable me to be a technical writer? So what's your say on that, Quentin?
No, not at all. I know a lot of great technical writers who do not know how to program. What they do know how to do is ask questions to the experts when they don't understand something. So even people who don't know, or before they started being a technical writer for an API, did not know what an API was. So they came up with a list of questions for their engineers. They asked them. They did research on APIs. They looked at the documentation of other APIs. So you can absolutely get away without knowing a programming language. And also remember that there are a lot of products out there that aren't geared towards developers. We are talking a lot about developer documentation here because that's the world I come from and the world Wisdom comes from. But there's a lot of products out there that are completely different, like hardware devices. And so you definitely don't need to know how to program in order to write documentation for a thermometer, for example, or an air quality device.
All right, that's awesome. Thank you so much. So someone asked, hope you're getting the Quentin slide. Yes, you're getting the Quentin slide. So he would add the slides to our repo, so you can also check it out from there. All right, so Faith.
So good evening, everybody. All right, I wanted to ask, as a technical writer, if you're asked to build and write, how long do you think it's going to take for you, or how long do you think a company expects you to take for that to be achieved?
I think I might have missed part of that. How long will it take for what to be achieved for a specific article?
Asked to build a project and then write on it as a technical writer. How long do you think you're supposed to give for that particular write up and building? Is it that you're supposed to just give a short term, or it's meant to be for, let's say, a month?
I think for software, just for documentation for software, just like software itself, we follow an iterative process. So for the accumulate documentation, for example, we've had the docs up, for the last year. But if you looked at it a year ago, there was maybe 1/10 of the content that there is today. So the answer is that it's never really fully complete, especially with software, since software is constantly being updated. And every time there's an update, you have to go back, reread the documentation that you wrote, and fix anything that may be obsolete now or may be out of date. With our content, I think usually Wisdom probably takes you about 1 to 2 weeks for a specific guide. So you can use that maybe as a measurement, but again, it varies widely depending on the complexity of the topic and depending on the product itself. So I don't think timing is as important as making sure you can break it down into bite-sized pieces so you can deliver those pieces one by one instead of waiting to have all the documentation done at once and then delivering it all at once. Because if we did that, then we still wouldn't have our documentation up right now.
Yeah, for sure. So let me add to what Quentin has said. So now probably a question I think is coming more from the writing agency part, where they'll probably give you a product to build, probably a project to build, then write about it. So it's a two-way thing. One, it's going to come from the writing agency, where they would be the people to give you the time limit. Probably they will say, okay, we need this project in 3 weeks. So probably you might take 2 weeks to build and take 1 week to write. Or it's coming down to you, where they will say probably, how long do you think you would take to build this project and write? And like Quentin said, it's also down to the complexity of the project. So the project is too complex, which means you need to buy more time. And like he also said, try to break it down, so you try to deliver it in more of like a deliverables, where you have chunk, more like units of the docs to submit. So boiling down to what he said again, probably not like you're trying to build everything and just submit. It's going to be very difficult. So maybe you create a plan where I'll probably take this week to build the aspect of this project, take these few days to build this other aspect of the project, take probably the last days of the week to probably complete this aspect of the project. So you just have it like module and module, so you don't have that pressure pile up on you. Then when you're done, you also jump down to the technical writing aspect, where you tell them, okay, I think since I'm done with the complex part of building the project, this is the aspect, this is the number of days or weeks I will need. So it's a two-way thing, coming from your writing agency, and the next one is also coming from you, deciding how long you think you can also deliver that project. So we have one question from Wisdom. He said, is it possible to write a documentary on product that you have not used yourself?
So personally, I would definitely encourage you to use whatever product you're documenting. It may be possible to do it without, but in order to put yourself in the shoes of the user, you really need to have that level of experience with the product. So if for some reason you're not able to use the product because you don't have the right equipment, or something of that sort, then you'll have to get creative and think of other ways to experience that product. But the experience is important.
Okay, so
so I would definitely pursue. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so I have one more question. So I'll take like two questions and we'll have to wrap up. So the question I have here is by Bolo Watife. So Bolo Watife, do you want to should I read it out or probably say that yourself? Bolo Watife.
Sorry, can you ask that again?
Yeah, I'm asking her if you want me to read out the question myself or maybe she go ahead. Bolo Watife, are you here? Okay, so maybe let me go at myself. All right, so she
Let me
asked.
go ahead. Yes, I am. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay, all right. All right, said is technical writing employed in data science and artificial intelligence technical skills? That is one, I guess. Then the second is okay, so it's only okay, or is it only in product design, software development skills we employ in technical writing? So I don't know if you understand the question.
So to answer that question, I mean, technical writing is important for any product, no matter what it is. And there are data science platforms out there. There are data science services. There are artificial intelligence services out there. There's a lot of AI services out there these days. And any level of expertise with those fields is definitely helpful if you want to pursue technical writing for that field. So yeah, it's absolutely employed in those fields. It's employed in any field where you may see a software service or product, which definitely includes data science and artificial intelligence.
All right, so let's take the last question so we wrap up the call. So, okay, Anthony, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
All right,
Let's
go
take one. All right, we have been saying technical writing and documentation. So there is something, I might be doing something which I don't know if is part of the technical writing. So I want to confirm this. There's some company outside Nigeria here. What they usually do, they deal on e-commerce platforms like PrestaShop, Magento. So they always design, develop these extensions or add-ons. So after doing that, they usually send it to me. Then I'll write a documentation on the process, like a manual, how the software works, and also how to install it on the platform. So I want to know if that's part of the technical writing as
well. 100%. Absolutely. That is most definitely technical writing. And that's a lot of what our documentation at Accumulate is as well. It's installation documentation. It's a usage guide or manual. We don't generally use the word manual, but it's exactly the same thing.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so thank you so much, guys, for this, and thank you, Quentin, for this, for taking your time to let us know how to write great documentations and how to be great technical writers. So to hear more from Quentin, so Quentin, I don't know if you can share your LinkedIn profile and Twitter profile so they can follow you and probably ask more questions to you after this.
Sure. Yeah, I will share. I can share both. Let me bring up the.
All right,
the
guys.
link,
So let's thank Quentin. Probably maybe a thank you in the chat or probably a clap because it's not easy to bring out your 30 minutes or more to teach us all this and take your time to answer so much questions. So Quentin, thank you once again for your time and for the great advice and great knowledge that we have learned today.
Absolutely. And I gave you the wrong link for LinkedIn, so I'll have Wisdom send out those links along with the presentation later.
Okay, all right, sure. All right, thank you guys for this, and thank you, Quentin. So Have a nice night and nice morning and nice afternoon from wherever you are. All right, bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.